Steve Schaller, one of our speakers, is involved in private practice. He's prosecuted claims under the False Claims Act and whistleblower claims. He's prosecuted claims against Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, among other companies. Mr. Schaller is currently involved in litigation with Johnson & Johnson over the drug Risperdal. As a result of his work, the United States government has benefited in excess of $7 billion. When we met with Steve about a month and a half ago to talk about this, we found out, myself and President Rogers, that he and his wife are very involved in charitable acts in the Philadelphia community. We thank Steve. His wife had an event last night for the opera, which he missed. He made that sacrifice to be with us today. In the past 2 years, he and his wife had made generous donations to both Temple University as well as Drexel University. Although this has nothing to do with his topic today, when we had lunch with them, we found out in the year 2000, Steve initiated a lawsuit in Palm County, Florida, over the Bush-Gore litigation, and he started the litigation over the butterfly ballots, although that's probably for another day. Joe Trautwein has been involved with the U.S. Department of Justice. He has been a U.S. attorney, and he is now in private practice. When he was with the U.S. Attorney's Office, he reached a settlement with Eli Lilly in excess of $1.4 billion, which at the time was the largest settlement ever reached. Steve presently is in private practice. He lectures on the False Claims Act, and he also is an adjunct professor at Widener University. And something that is not on his bio that I received from a reliable source, if Bill Pugh IV is a reliable source, was that at one point Joe was a sub-4-minute miler. So we will let Joe tell you whether or not that's true. With that, I would ask Joe and Steve to come up to address the Montgomery Bar Association.
Steve and I first would like to thank the Montgomery County Bar Association for inviting us here to speak and sacrificing your Saturday mornings to come and listen to us talk. This bar organization does tremendous things, not only outside of our community, but me and Steve are both part of that community. We benefit greatly, and we thank you. I look out onto the crowd, and I see a lot of friendly faces. I feel like I'm at home. I actually live in Erdenheim, and I'm neighbors of the Pughs. And actually can look out from my house and see the Pugh estate from my house. I don't know if any of you have visited the Pugh compound, but it's a wonderful tourist attraction. I can only see the gift house from my driveway. I've never been invited, but if you do get a chance, I hear it's tremendous.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget. Bill and I know each other too. I have a connection to France for many years. I represented Air France years ago, and I have a daughter who's on the board of the French National Railway Foundation, and Bill rented an apartment that I owned in Paris a number of years ago, and he came up to me today, and we're still arguing about whether he gets his security deposit back. But then I see some other good friends of mine here. Steve Hewsome and I are classmates from Penn Law. His wife, I just learned today, we're both from Brooklyn, and she went to Midwood High, and I went to Erasmus. So it's a small world. Manny Burton and I go way back. We practiced law together. And I lived in Montgomery County until recently, and I moved into the city of Philadelphia. So it's like being back with my old friends. And I can tell you some stories about Steve, but he made me promise not to say anything.
So we're going to apologize up front. I heard a little bit about last year's conference, and I heard it was a great success. Bill Sr. actually got up here with some of his colleagues and talked about some of the successes of their great careers, which is really why we're here. We were brought in to fact-check some of those stories. We actually had some whistleblowers come forth, and to those individuals, I would suggest that you get your personal things in order. There are a lot of
you didn't see the camera on our button, did you?
So I thought we'd get started. We've titled this An American Hustle, Whistleblowers and Prosecuting False Claims. A lot of you hear the word whistleblower, and there is a public image. When you hear the word whistleblower, you think, well, there's a snitch out there, or there's a rat, right? This individual is giving private information about their employers and their individual, maybe friends and families. And we're here to just talk to you a little bit about those cases. And we wanted to show you some of the impacts that those cases have had, not only in your lives, but on, throughout nationwide.
Well, trial lawyers just love to get hold of a case like this next one. Eli Lilly pleading guilty to criminal conduct after skating under the radar for years. The company striking a deal to pay a record $1 billion, folks, $420 million to settle criminal and civil investigations involving the antipsychotic drug Zyprexa.
I'm honored to stand here today with dedicated colleagues from within the Department of Justice as well as beyond it to announce a historic settlement with Pfizer Incorporated. In a combination civil and criminal settlement, Pfizer has agreed to pay $2.3 billion, the largest healthcare fraud settlement in the history of the Department of Justice.
The pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca has agreed to pay $520 million to federal and state taxpayers to settle claims that it illegally marketed the antipsychotic drug CLE for uses that were not approved as safe and effective by the Food and Drug Administration.
Today I'm pleased to announce that the Justice Department and our law enforcement partners have reached an historic $3 billion resolution with the pharmaceutical manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline, LLC.
The alleged conduct is shameful, and it is unacceptable. It displayed a reckless indifference to the safety of the American people.
As you watch that video and you see those numbers, there's a couple themes that come through. One, every time one of those individuals speaks, and it's beginning back in 2009 and most recently in the end of 2013, they use the word historic. And the reason why is these cases keep growing, each one of them, astronomical sizes. The other thing I want you to point out here is this, as this graphic by ProPublica shows. ProPublica, for those of you who don't know, is a leading watchdog group that tracks these types of cases. As you can see, beginning in 2009, these cases start to grow, and the numbers range from 1.4 billion all the way up to 3 billion, as that video described. In the next slide, Steve didn't want me to put this up there, but I wanted to show of the top 8 settlements of all time. These 4 cases were brought by the Scheller law firm, and these cases wouldn't even have been on the scene had Steve not beginning to bring these cases back in the early 2000s. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of these cases came in door and landed on my desk, the first one, the Zyprexa case. Nobody even knew what off-label marketing was. Nobody knew the misleading practices that these pharmaceutical companies had on the public. These were foreign words to the government, off-label marketing. And none of us, and I think it would be even including Steve and the whistleblowers that brought these cases, would ever think that they would end up in results of this large.
You know, the interesting thing about this all started for me with my mother-in-law in Florida. So I thought I'd give you a little background of how the case has developed. My mother-in-law lived in Boca Raton. She passed away recently, but it was Election Day 2000 and the Bush versus Gore election, as you know, and she called me midday and was apoplectic because she thought she voted for Buchanan, and she started telling me about the butterfly ballot. So Ed Rendell and I are friendly friends, and he was head of the Democratic National Committee at the time, and I called Ed up and I said, Ed, my mother-in-law, something wrong in Palm Beach County. And Ed said, I know your mother-in-law, don't get carried away. He does know her, by the way. Anyway, so what happens next is I get a call about 4 in the morning, and Ed is on the phone. I actually had represented the city of Philadelphia and was very active in the tobacco litigation, represented the Attorney General's settlement for the state of California, and so we were connected through tobacco litigation as well. And Ed said, I think your mother-in-law may be onto something. Get your parachute on. I want you to go over there on your own dime and find out what's going on. So I got a couple of friends of mine who were attorneys in Palm Beach and Broward County, went down to Florida, and we learned Harris, the Secretary of State of Florida, was about to certify the Palm Beach County results. My mother-in-law introduced me to all these elderly people from her community, and my father-in-law, and they told me what was going on. And, well, the first thing I thought of is, I've got to do something. So and my standard reaction was file a class action and an injunction. So I got my team together. We filed the first suit in Florida on Bush versus Gore. We enjoined, actually I got a temporary restraining order, and this is history you may not be aware of, against Harris certifying the Palm Beach County results in the Bush versus Gore election. What happens next is you have to have as you all know, the judges, you have to have a hearing within 10 days and all this kind of stuff. I hold the all-time record for judge recusals in Palm Beach County, 5 in 1 week. So we end up with Judge LaBarga, who was a very nice gentleman, and the litigation goes forward, and we learned at the time that Gore actually won, in my opinion, by a lot of votes. But what Judge LaBarga did is he ordered the recount, and he established the basis of the recount. We remember the hanging chads and all that kind of stuff. You should also know that those ballots were manufactured in Addison, Texas. And there were lots of litigation going on after that. I won't get into it, but that's what happens while I'm there. Gary Farmer, who was one of my co-counsel, gets a call from a woman whose son, 16-year-old son, got Prozac extended release in the mail, free, never had a prescription. We learned that what was going on in South Florida is that Eli Lilly was sending out free Prozac extended release in the mail because they were going to lose the patent shortly on Prozac. They went to Walgreens, paid them to send it out, and they got doctors who they were friendly with to give a prescription on a one-letter thing with every patient they ever had who had taken an SSRI. And the next thing is, you know, these products the Prozac's being sent all over Florida. This woman was upset. I ended up on national television about it. And the next thing I know is I get a call from Lilly detail reps from Florida. Florida, from California, and from Oregon. So I said, what? They're selling, and they start telling me they're doing the same thing in those states. So I go out, and the next thing I know, they start telling me not only about that, but they tell me all about Zyprexa. I remembered way back there was a false claim statute from the Civil War days, and Joe explained that to you, and that was how the beginning of the Zyprexa key TAM cases got started. People in those days didn't, this is the year 2001 or so, that's how it all began.
So Steve, I wanted to just ask you, so I look at those numbers, and they're tremendous numbers up there. How much money did your mother-in-law get out of those numbers? She basically made your career.
Luckily, I'm still married.
Yeah. So, I think the answer is 0.
She was pleased.
So what this has done, a lot of these cases have had, tremendous publicity, obviously, and the public is becoming aware of them. Next slide. And what that has resulted in, as recently reported in the Legal Intelligencer, is that the whistleblower actions throughout the nation are growing in size and growing in numbers. Next slide. As Forbes recently published, it dedicated 2014, the year of the whistleblower. And it's now a warning not only the public but industry that it's time to strengthen up your internal compliance programs to make sure that fraud isn't happening. And if it is happening and you're not taking care of it, there are going to be individuals in your corporations that are going to take the risk and report this information to the government. Okay, next slide. So as you can see here, we put a slide together which just shows the number of whistleblower matters filed per year. Some things happened in 1986 where the statute was amended, made it easier to bring these suits. Beginning in 1987, there was about maybe 30 suits filed in 1987. And then compare that now with 2013, you have almost 800 suits filed throughout the nation alleging fraud by companies and individuals. Next slide. And these things have resulted in tremendous settlements. Beginning in 1987, I think the largest amount the federal government collected during that year was $30 million. And this chart isn't updated, but in 2013, the federal government collected well over $5 billion as a result of these suits. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the False Claims Act. And what the False Claims Act does is it provides liability to anybody that knowingly submits a false claim to the government for payment or causes someone to submit a false claim to the federal government for payment. And we're talking about only in instances where there's government funds involved. It was originally established back during the Civil War days by Abraham Lincoln and the Congress there. It's commonly referred to as the Lincoln Law. And during the Civil War, many of the contractors that contracted with the government to provide supplies during the Civil War, took the money and ran, supplied inferior products, and a lot of money was being wasted. So what this law was intended to do was to go after these companies that were doing misconduct. It had a unique little clause in it which is called a qui-tam clause. And a qui-tam is a word from the past that means basically bringing a suit on behalf of the king. So it encouraged private citizens that knew and were aware of this fraud to bring cases on behalf of the United States to recoup that money. All of your taxpayers, all these fraud individuals that are taking government money are taking government money, out of programs that you funded. So what the statute did is it allowed individuals to come forth, sue on behalf of the United States, and share in the recovery. In 1986, the statute was amended. The original statute, the awards were sort of arbitrary, and the damages that were available under the False Claims Act were minimum. So it wasn't very profitable for the United States to bring these suits or to individuals to bring these suits on behalf of the United States. So in 1986, there was an uptick in the amount of defense funding, and so we started to see the same thing again. Toilet seats.
$200 toilet seats, $300 toilet seats, all kinds of major misconduct. We would see things like not just toilet seats, that was in the defense, but in the healthcare industry, doctors submitting bills to Medicare and Medicaid. And the qui-tam Act only covers federal government funds and states that have Medicare and Medicaid funds. It does not provide the same protections for private insurance like Blue Cross. So this is just government money. And for example, doctors overbilling or things like that, we would discover, and Joe will explain how the investigative techniques. But the unusual aspect about this is 29 states now have these statutes. Several cities do, including New York, Chicago, San Diego, Philadelphia, and Allegheny County. But states and cities without these statutes, without this false claim statute, are throwing away millions and perhaps billions of dollars.
I want to just talk to you before you go, Steve, just real quick. What the amendment did is it also increased the damages that these companies are now liable for. So it's treble the damages, whatever the government is out, times 3. In addition, you get 5 to 10K. The original amendment was 10K, now it's up to 11.5 for each false claim submitted. And you may have only one contract where there's only one request for payment. It's not a lot of money. But you're talking about defense contractors and healthcare providers that submit hundreds and thousands of invoices to the government. So if you take those hundreds and thousands and times them by $5,000 to $10,000 each time that false claim is submitted, you get tremendous dollars. So this is really the damages that Steve's talking about when these states are not passing False Claims Act statutes. This is the kind of things that they're missing. Go ahead, Steve.
Pennsylvania does not have a False Claims Act statute, unfortunately. So, there's the decision. They tried to go off on their own, the Attorney General at the time, and Ed Rendell tried to go off on his own. But as you can see, what happened, and this was on the Risperdal case involving Johnson & Johnson. Pennsylvania appeals court handed a legal victory to J&J, upholding the total dismissal of their lawsuit for improperly marketing the antipsychotic Risperdal. What happened with Risperdal, you're not allowed, a drug company cannot market a drug and try to push it off-label. Most of Risperdal prescriptions are what we call off-label, meaning not approved for the use by the FDA. In fact, it wasn't approved for children at all for anything at the time. And what happened is hundreds of millions of dollars were being collected by Johnson & Johnson each year. So what ended up happening, because, and I won't go into all the specifics, but you can see the appellate court said that they're not since a drug manufacturer isn't a provider of medical goods and services to Medicaid recipients, its conduct doesn't support civil remedies under the state's Medicaid Fraud Control Act.
And that would be completely different if the Pennsylvania were able to sue under the False Claims Act.
And I can tell you that this has cost Pennsylvania alone, in my one case, Risperdal, over $50 million.
So you think about what Pennsylvania is going through right now, and it's in economic times. That would be money well spent in the school systems. But tell them what about Texas?
Texas, which has a false claims statute, cooperated with us, with the federal government, and in addition to the $2.2 billion that we got for the federal government and the states with the whistleblower statutes, Texas got $158 million because the Attorney General was working closely to get the evidence that we had gotten. We got, and a lot of the evidence, believe it or not, this is both a criminal and civil case in the False Claims Act. So there's criminal conduct and civil. In the Johnson & Johnson case, they have pled guilty to illegally marketing for the elderly. That's as a misdemeanor. And they got fined for that. You'll see some more information about that. And then you have the civil aspects. So the False Claims Act is very unusual. It's a combination of civil and criminal.
We'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Before you go there real quick, so just one of the things, points that Steve is raising, so it's just one suit that he showed you that Pennsylvania is out and recovering some of the money that it's owed. If you go back to 1986, all the way up to the present, easily, those dollars could easily exceed $1 billion, not only in the amount of money that they could have recovered sharing in these large government settlements, but also encouraging citizens to bring forth false claims actions for money that Pennsylvania is spending and is being defrauded.
Yeah. And what makes it worse is that had the conduct been pursued, lots of people would not have been subjected to serious injuries, which ends up being billed for the treatment to Medicare and Medicaid. They use these drugs, particularly the antipsychotics, for the purpose of controlling, they actually had ads to the different homes for the elderly. Save money on your staff. 5 milligrams at 5 p.m. So you won't need staff. They were giving these pills to the elderly, and there's a black box warning now on it that this unfortunately suppresses their heart, and actually they die.
So you think about the harm that's not only to the state by recovering the money that you actually spent on the drugs, but think about all the harm that the state now has to spend taking care of these individuals that's not recovered.
Yeah, so let's think of the families, what they've gone through.
So that's just an example of what maybe, folks are interested in that, getting behind, maybe even the bar getting behind the passing of a False Claims Act statute in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I have in my will, if I end up in a nursing home, and you should keep this in mind for your parents and yourselves, no doctor will ever shall prescribe any antipsychotic drug to me or my family. And I don't think they should be permitted to prescribe them. But what you should know is doctors are free to prescribe off-label if they choose to. And of course, they don't tell you in many instances of the danger. So I'm just giving you some good information for yourselves and your families on that. And Risperdal for children is causing boys, by the way, to grow breasts. I won't tell you the whole story, but that's another problem. Right?
So that just gives you an example type of cases in the healthcare world. But if you go to the next slide, These are the types of key TAM cases that are normally brought. Obviously, the largest part is 53% of these types of cases are brought in the healthcare industry. Since all time, they've brought in about $26 billion, 1/4 of that coming directly from Scheller's cases. The other thing you see up there is 19% of them are Department of Defense cases. These are cases where the Department of Defense is spending for all kinds of goods. One of the recent ones that we saw out there in the public were the vests that were made to protect our troops overseas, that were made improperly and were made with inferior materials. The other types of cases now are the other 28% are cases that come from industries outside healthcare and the Department of Defense. One big area right now is the Department of Education. You see a lot of news now about for-profit schools that are out there that are attracting students to come to their universities. Well, they're attracting students who are clearly unqualified to be in the universities, and they bring these students in. They collect their federal student money. The students aren't provided the access to succeed in these programs. They're not given proper education. They're not given the tools to succeed in these programs, and they wind up failing out. But the schools keep the money. It's big business. And the problem with that is you think about, well, how does that hurt the federal government? Well, the federal government gives out these student loans on the promise that these student loans are going to be paid back. And if these individuals aren't given the resources to go ahead and be successful out in the industry, the chances of them paying back those loans are minimal. So the federal government now is out that money. So you'll see a lot of False Claims Acts cases now involving education. This is one I wanted to bring up too, just to give you the far-reaching effect of the False Claims Act. You can I see that pointer for a second? I don't know if you can see there, but behind Lance Armstrong, I think that's William Pugh Sr. Right there. I don't know. Is that true? I think that is. I think he overtakes Lance Armstrong in the last half mile, if I'm not correct. But just as an example, this is one of the cases that I thought I'd bring out to show you how far-reaching this statute is. And we're talking about any government funds that are spent.
Yeah, and you see that U.S. mail emblem on Lance Armstrong.
Yeah.
Because the government invested, I think, $60 million in the American team, of course not knowing that it was being provided with drugs for performance improvement. And one of the whistleblowers was one of the members of the team. He came forward and actually also was on performance drugs.
Floyd Landis, if anybody knows that name.
He blew the whistle, and the government filed a False Claims Act claim to get their money back. And it's not just $60 million, it's treble, $180 million.
So this case is currently pending, and it's been going on for years. But basically the theory is that Lance Armstrong's team would go to the federal government, the Postal Service, and say, hey, sponsor us. In the contract there's a clause, and there's a promise to the government that they would follow all cycling rules, including not taking performance-enhancing drugs. And every time they signed that contract, year after year, these individuals knew, the team captain knew, that when they were signing that contract, it was false. So all those payments, the government is alleging now, is that those payments were induced based on those false statements. Had the government known that any of these individuals were taking these drugs, it wouldn't have sponsored the team. So the government is now asking for that money back.
And there's a criminal penalties that could be involved too, because both, so you're aware of it, both the Johnson & Johnson case and the Eli Lilly case with Zyprexa, there were guilty pleas to a federal misdemeanor.
You want to talk about that?
Sure. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that. That's a very common question. And
we get that from everybody. And,
Lance Armstrong, the individuals.
Yeah.
Right? It comes out of, they're actually suing. You can only sue really the people that either caused the fraud, caused the claims to submit it, or actually submitted the claims knowing that they were false. And here, both the team captain, who knew that Lance was taking drugs, and Lance Armstrong himself. Yes?
Sure. Well, we're going to tell you a story, a true story. You're going to hear some interesting things. We'll get to it very shortly, because I do have concerns.
Do you want to talk about the unique...
I was mentioning the unique nature of the whistleblower law. It's a blend of criminal prosecution and large civil settlements. It's a true, and maybe the only one, of a private-public partnership. We lent the government our assets, our firm. They do not necessarily have the ability to pursue these cases without lawyers like us and a firm that can review millions of documents and willing to invest the money. The government, U.S. attorneys, and Joe will tell you, that's one of the key questions that go into the question. Who is the law firm bringing the case? Are they able to give them the support? Because frankly, they just don't have the number of people necessary or the ability to do all the kind of highly skilled e-discovery that's involved. What happens with a key TAM case, it's filed under seal, and it doesn't, and the government, what usually happens is they issue a subpoena to the company, which the company gets the first note that something is wrong. And of course, preservation of documents, and then they produce millions of documents. And all these cases I've been involved with, you talk about documents, almost every single one involves millions of documents, the ability to finance a discovery process where you're reviewing them. The government lends us FBI agents, FDA agents. They use all kinds of interesting techniques. They tap phones.
Let's talk about that. And just to follow up on Steve's point, it's as the U.S. Attorney's Office when these cases first came in, to be able to get an agent to work on these cases is very difficult. The government's resources, even now to this day, are extremely limited. So if you don't partner up with a firm that has the resources to be able to review these documents, provide the resources in drafting subpoenas and briefs, the cases could be in trouble. So we wanted to talk about, okay, so this case is brought by Steve's firm. It comes to us, it comes to the government. Then what happens? Well, on the government side, prosecution of these cases has become the primary objective. And the reason why is everybody's starting to see the dollars that these cases are bringing back. For every $1 that the federal government spends prosecuting these cases, the government gets $10 back. Now, anybody on Wall Street would love those odds. I wish we could invest in these claims for the government. But really what the agencies do, they look at that and they say, okay, great, we share in those recoveries. They get a percentage. Each individual agency gets a percentage of that recovery, which means more printers, more employees, more effective investigations.
And that's after payment of costs, the relators share, all expenses related. They get approximately $10 for every $1 they spend.
That's correct. So inside the government, you'll have most of your investigation agencies. Just about every agency has a Office of Inspector General or something similar. And these are the agents that come knocking on your door. These are the agents that are out there doing the interviews. Also, you'll have the FDA, the FBI, Department of Veteran Affairs, Department of Labor, fraud units of all the individual states. So just like the federal government, each one of these states that passes a False Claims Act has similar type agents that are out there to help support these cases. And how does the government gather the evidence? Well, prior to 1986, there weren't many whistleblower cases out there. These amendments now encouraged individuals to come forth, and it increased the awards that were available to these individuals in coming forth. Since then, we've seen a huge spike in the amount of claims. So primarily, I would say over 80 to 90% of the cases under the False Claims Act come from whistleblowers. And they come from offices like Steve's that are able to gather up that information and bring those cases. Now, who are these whistleblowers? These are friends, these are colleagues, they're relatives, they're neighbors, they're doctors, nurses.
Bicycle racers.
Yeah, bicycle racers, strangers, anybody that's aware.
In the profit universities, they could be a bookkeeper. In a doctor's office, Joe and I are involved in some cases. A tremendous problem in the state of Florida. Yeah. We have other cases where fraud is immense with treatments going on there, treatments that never occurred, bills for things that can't be billed for, and the ability to find those things are very interesting, because you find things like ambulance charges for patients who are already hospitalized, moving from room to room every day.
Everything's electronic these days, right? So anything that's submitted to the government.
The stuff we find is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. We have to do a lot of data mining to find those things. And then, of course, the wiring up of our clients, they go to meetings.
Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, you have the subpoenas, you have documents, emails, wiretaps, a lot of that video surveillance. We even have had the government set up fictitious companies. They actually do that. Patients, suppliers, colleagues, anybody you come in contact with. If you're on the defense, you better advise your clients to watch their emails. The stuff we find in emails is mind-boggling.
You look at these social websites.
Social
right
websites.
It's a tremendous resource for this type of information. With everything being electronic, you have to be concerned. Anything you're writing, anything you're saying, anybody that you come in contact is somehow going to turn out to be evidence in these cases.
And they don't know, because the cases are under seal. They don't have any information as to who is doing what, because they just don't know who to trust and not to trust.
The technology nowadays for being able to record statements to video conduct is tremendous. I remember, and this was, the government's come a long way now, but they used to put the cameras right in the buttons, so as you're talking. I remember we wired up a doctor one time to catch a sales rep off-label marketing. So we wired up the doctor, and I don't know whether it's a sign of the times, but doctors, and I apologize if there's any out there, some of them are not as in shape as they used to be. So when the doctor sat down, the button, rather than going forward...
We had this happen. We were so upset we didn't get it.
It sticks straight up in the air, so I got 2.5 hours of looking at the ceiling rather than
It's a true story, by the way.
So when I picked my witnesses now, I usually look for somebody that's a little bit more in shape to do these.
Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind is that they will suddenly, an FBI agent or an FDA investigator will suddenly show up on your doorstep. And a false statement to an FBI agent or an FDA agent is a criminal offense. And we've seen things turn around because we've gotten them on false statements and things like that.
Sometimes a false statement, when you go and interview these individuals, you expect the truth and get the information that you want. Sometimes a false statement's even better, because now they have a choice. Either they join the government's, out there buying a USA government sweatshirt and joining the team, or they're facing charges themselves. So it usually helps bring the case forward. So the next slide here we wanted to talk about is how these cases are chosen. You saw the increase in number of cases filed per year. But as you can imagine, not all these cases are successful. Not all of these cases can the government pursue. So we wanted to talk about some of the types of cases that the government's looking at. If you go to the next slide here real quick. What matters to the federal government? And here we've been giving a lot of dollars, but we want to talk a little bit about public
harm. And what
harm.
matters to me, because I don't take any cases. I want to put a stop to people being harmed by using drugs and products, and it's much more than just money involved. You're talking about health and your welfare and your family, and that's what gets me upset. And that, frankly, is what got me going in this in the first place, because I was extremely disturbed at the conduct of the drug companies here.
So you look at that, and when any case that you bring to the government, regardless of the dollar amount, it could be very small dollars. But if it's causing serious public harm, primary focus, children and the elderly, if that harm is happening to those individuals, the government's usually going to get involved. The other aspect that the government looks at is, did they get what they paid for? The government is in business just like anybody else. And if it's making payments out there, and if you go to a car dealership and you expect a BMW, you wind up with, a Yugo or something like that, you're going to be angry, and you're going to say, hey, you know what? I didn't get what I paid for here. I want my money back. The government's the same way.
Right.
One other thing that the government always looks at is this conduct affecting the industry? Because you'll have a whole bunch of companies out there trying to do the right thing, trying to compete for the government's money in a particular business, and whether it's defense contracting or the healthcare industry. And they're doing the right things. And you have this other group here that's cutting corners, and they're gaining an edge on these other companies. These other companies are now not able to pay their employees. They're filing for bankruptcy. So that affects the industry, right? The number of choices that are out there and the number of individuals that are employed by these companies is now being affected. So that's important to the government, right? When they're going out, they don't want to have to shop at one store every time. They like choices out there. It helps the industry. So if that's affecting the industry, they'll go for those cases. The last thing that one of the other things that they'll look at too is whether the conduct is hard to prove. They have to look at how much they're going to spend prosecuting these cases versus what they're going to get at the end. So are there public policy arguments why the government want to pursue these cases? You may have some drugs out there that are cancer drugs. They're experimental, right? And folks are on their, or have no other choice but to look for solutions. Yeah. Drug companies may offer these solutions to individuals even though they haven't gone through the FDA process and seen that they're approved. There may be studies out there that the industry can rely upon. Well, the government really isn't in the business of denying those individuals those opportunities to try those experimental drugs.
Yeah. So there may be off-label marketing going on, but they do not, if the drug is really necessary, there are no alternatives. They're not going to prosecute that usually. And the same thing is true of even off-label marketing of some other competitive drugs. The FDA approves a lot of drugs that are similar in their effect, but their safety profiles are very different quite often. That is the case, for example, with Risperdal, say, compared to Abilify. So the government will look at that and say, well, there is an alternative medication that doesn't have the same problem. And that will factor into what the government does with the case. In other words, they know Risperdal may be worse than another drug, and they're off-label marketing it, and there are alternatives that are safer. That gets them moving sometimes.
So we thought we'd run through real quickly a quick case study. We're going to talk about the Eli Lilly case. You heard a little bit about it before. And Eli Lilly was, prior to this case, was a company that had a very good reputation in the industry. It was a specialty drug company. Individuals, with diabetes or other types of specialized disease that would rely on Eli Lilly for these drugs to help them with their diseases. They then eventually patented a drug called Prozac. And this drug, by the mid to late 90s, mid to late 80s, became a tremendous profit source for the company. It wound up being close to $2 billion of its revenue. And as you can imagine, the company grew, more employees, more things that the company had to support. But they ran into a problem. Prozac was losing its patent. So $2 billion of revenue was about to end.
$2 billion per year.
Per year. And they didn't know how to substitute it. So they went out and they looked at their drug spectrum, and they came up with the drug Zyprexa. And they wanted to say, hey, you know what? Let's make this drug the next blockbuster drug. Let's go to the facts here real quick. So a little bit about Zyprexa. Zyprexa is a drug for the treatment of schizophrenia. It's a short-term treatment. It's basically when you're in the phase of schizophrenia, when you're hallucinating, you're hospitalized, they need something to get the individuals a little more comfort and a little bit more under control. So it was basically approved for less than 1% of the patient population. So it was a very specific drug. Not a lot of money in this drug, but a very, very small patient population. So what the company decided to do was say, wait, let's look at this drug. Is there any way we can make this drug a daily use drug? Can we market it in the general doctor's offices for conditions that those doctors see every day? Is there a way to take this drug, which is a $300 a month drug with some serious side effects, and put it in the everyday doctor's office to treat symptoms that they see every day?
Similar to Prozac, which doesn't have anywhere near the dangers that Zyprexa does. And what else about it is it's sort of like, I look at it, they have a general who's in charge. And they need to get studies out that say the drug can be used for this, that, and the other thing. So they actually have companies they hire who actually can control the peer-reviewed journals. They even own them. And they get studies published by thought leaders who don't disclose, although today there's more effort to disclose them, like Dr. Biederman from Harvard, where they pay him millions of dollars to come up with new disease names, bipolar disorder in children, studies where they actually modify, I call it, or delete data. And usually it's done through a front company. And then they have medical, we have this CLE, well, they have their CMEs. You wouldn't like to know that Joe and I work for...
We're paid by the Pew Law Firm.
By the Pew Law Firm.
No,
but that's what they do,
yeah.
And they don't disclose this. That gets out there. The doctors' community is affected, and they start prescribing the drug for hair loss, sleep, commonly prescribed for sleep.
Gambling addictions.
Gambling addictions, ADD, you name it. They come up with different, they always get some study published somewheres. And we, of course, now know who some of them are, but we're constantly finding new ones coming down the pipeline. The same thing went on, by the way, with other drugs like fen-phen. But now we're on to this through the False Claims Act.
So what they do is they provide doctors. How are you going to get the doctors to prescribe these drugs? These drugs, when you're talking about treating anxiety, mood disorders, nausea, gambling addictions, it's kind of like taking a sledgehammer to kill a fly. There are other alternatives out there for these patients to take, but the drug companies and the doctors are now in cahoots to sort of push these drugs forward. Yeah. So they provide doctors kickbacks, speaker fees, gifts, reimbursements, support, help with their studies.
You want your kid to get an A? Yeah. You're going to hear more about that soon. There's something Joe and I are involved with, but we can't disclose it under seal, but you'll hear more about that problem.
Upcoming in the next couple of weeks.
Yes.
There's another case that's coming down the pike. One of the other things to do, you say you have doctors, well, what about the concerns? What about the safety concerns of this drug? So what they would do is mislead the doctors about the safety concerns of this drug. This is a very powerful drug. One of the side effects is that it led to a serious weight gain, up to 30 pounds in a month from taking this drug. So what they would do to those doctors and say, hey, you know what, most of these patients, they're thin, they're not eating right, they could use a little weight gain. Or, do you have any other patients that are suffering from other weight loss disease? This might be a good drug to take to get that weight back on.
Yeah, it gets worse than that. Eli Lilly makes insulin pens and insulin. The drug reps were being told, discount the weight gain, because increased weight leads to diabetes. They were pushing this drug knowing that they were going to make money on the back end by selling insulin. They were telling their reps that. We're going to make money coming and going. They picked the doctors. They had their own song. What was it?
Right. We'll talk about that in a little of the evidence here, but they did have it. One of the things, they got to get their sales reps all jazzed up to go out and sell this drug. So the song Viva Las Vegas became Viva Zyprexa. And they would sit there in auditoriums like this with their sales reps and play this song to get their reps charged up to go out there and sell this drug. One of the things we talk about, there was the brand leader comes out in a purple suit. Purple's like the drug's a purple pill. He comes out in a purple tux trying to get this crowd all jazzed up. We actually seized the purple suit. I was going to wear it today, but it was...
Yeah. Then they
they
want to target children. They have Risperdal. Believe it or not, actually has Legos with the Risperdal name for children's offices. They had Seroquel would have, Risperdal also had Risperdal popcorn bags. Seroquel had candy jars with the name Seroquel to put in doctors' offices and fill them with Seroquel with candy, as if it was a candy. I mean, the stuff they do is mind-boggling.
So basically, Eli Lilly took what was basically about a $100 million drug total, a couple $100 million, and became a multi-billion-dollar drug per year. At its heyday, it was almost close to $8 billion a year. So where did this evidence come from? Obviously, we were lucky. I was in my U.S. Attorney's office sitting there going over some, as a civil AUSA.
I show up.
Yeah, civil AUSA, I'm doing, some postal employment case. And Steve shows up and he says, Joe, I have this off-label marketing case I want you to look at. I didn't even know what it meant. And I said, okay, great, Steve. Just
in
leave it
those
to me.
days, we didn't know about this. I didn't know much about the False Claims Act other than Steve and I probably, Steve Houston and I must have had some lecture on it back in law school, and I remembered it, luckily.
So he brought me these whistleblowers. And I just want to talk to you just real briefly about these whistleblowers, because everybody, like I said in the beginning, thinks of that term, these people are rats. You know, they're snitches. They're lying to the company. These whistleblowers were sales reps. They were certified.
And they were pharmacists.
They had license. They were actually individuals that are out there in the industry making a change. They knew a lot about these drugs. They knew a lot about what the doctors do. What happens to these drug companies, though, they start pushing these individuals out because the doctor's offices are responding more to cheerleaders and young athletic males that are coming out into the industry versus the old pharmacists who are marketing these drugs. So those folks are getting pushed out. And they're not only getting pushed out, if they don't follow this practice of off-label marketing and marketing this stuff to kids. Could you imagine being a licensed professional, knowing everything you know about this industry, and you're told you need to market this drug to this doctor for prescriptions for kids, and you see what happens to those kids?
They actually complained internally to their in-house lawyer counsel. Believe it or not, they actually went up the line trying to do something.
So you think about these individuals now, they're just after the money. They couldn't care less about
They
the
didn't
money.
know about it.
They didn't know about any
because
recovery.
no one knew in those days that they could get, anywhere from 10 to 30% of the government's recovery. That wasn't on their mind at all. They were worried about the injuries they were creating to people and their license. And one of them got so upset he began treatment and ended up leaving the company and getting a job with a competing company, AstraZeneca, because no one knew he was a whistleblower by that time because it was under seal. He calls me up a few months later after he started his new job with AstraZeneca. Steve, you won't believe it, they're doing the same thing with Seroquel. And that is how we got $520 million from AstraZeneca.
So just real quick, I know we're running out of time. I wanted to show you. So you have the information that comes from these whistleblowers. You also have emails, phone messages, song, the marketing materials we talked about. The data mining was great use in this case because it showed what the doctor's prescribing habits were before any sales rep showed up. And then what happened after the sales rep. As soon as this doctor began receiving gifts, got on speaker programs, what happened right after that happened? You see a tremendous increase in the amount of drugs that they were prescribing. Undercover recording, sales visits, videotapes, marketing, all that.
And that was all done in the Zyprexa case.
Yeah. So what did this result into? So 7 years later, that's about the average length of these cases. I know 7 years because during that time I had 7 children. My wife had 7 children. We named them Eli and Lily and Billion. Not really. But I get a call. I remember this was on President's Day. And I don't know if there's any government workers out here, but we value our government holidays. And I did not want to meet with the company, but they said, "Lo, it's important. Let's try to get this case resolved." And I said, "Look, I got my children. I might be able to get away for nap time." So they said, "Okay, we'll come to you." I live in Erdenheim, and wound up meeting us up at McNally's restaurant. I don't know if you're familiar with that restaurant in Chestnut Hill. So I go in there. I meet with the counsel there, and we start talking for a little bit. And he passes me a napkin across the table, and he says, "Okay, what's it going to take to get this case resolved?" And I had thought about this a lot. It wasn't sort of like, pulling a number out of the air, but we had done damage models, and we came up with what it would take to resolve this case. So I wrote on the napkin, I was going to write $1.4 billion.
It's a true story.
But I wrote it down the first time. I had no idea how many zeros are in a billion. So the first time I think I was 3 short, and the next time I was way too many. And I excused myself and actually went back, pretended I was going to the bathroom. On the way back, asked the bartender if anybody knew at the bar how many zeros were in a billion, and luckily they were able to tell me, and I was able to write it down. I should have just put 1.4 B, but I wasn't sure of it. But thanks to the McNally's bartenders, I was able to get that right. So you have this resolution. A lot of it goes towards criminals. Some in there you'll see what the civil resolution was that went back to the federal government. But you also have these what are called corporate integrity agreements. So besides signing...
it's like probation.
Yeah, signing these large settlements, the company now has to come up with an internal reporting program to make sure that this conduct doesn't happen along. Now we get real quickly, I know we're running out of time, we get to real quickly your question before Why is no one going to jails for these crimes? And it's an important question. Here you have a $1.4 billion case where the company pled to a misdemeanor. What's that? Any criminal prosecutor would be like, that's a joke. Well, there's a good reason for it. These companies, they not only make these drugs and push these drugs off-label market for off-label market reasons, but they also make a lot of other drugs that the public uses, such as the diabetes drugs, which are proven drugs that help a lot of people. And you have a lot of government employees or are on government assistance programs that use these drugs. And if the company were to plead to a felony, the company would then be excluded from participating in any of those government programs. So we have to sort of do a balance act here and say, okay, are we going to convict this company, make them plead to a felony? And if we do so, they are now banned from participating in these federal programs, which a lot of individuals are going to be hurt doing. Or do we come up with some other solution? And that's really what the corporate integrity agreement is there for now.
Yeah. I don't agree. I think they should go to jail, and I think something needs to happen very shortly. These things have got to be stopped, and jail is necessary. And when you start seeing billions of dollars for the government, you hesitate. It's a tough trial because they're going to fight it like crazy because the CEO, for example, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, he lives here in Doylestown. And can you prove it up the line, or are you going to end up getting some lower-level employees? These are not easy investigations.
So what the government has done with these corporate integrity agreements now, it's not only the companies themselves that are now held to a higher standard, but it's the individuals also. We're talking about the executives. We're talking about the vice presidents. Yeah. We're talking about board members. They now have, because of these corporate integrity agreements, now have to acknowledge that there are training programs in place to make sure that this conduct doesn't happen. And that if this conduct were to happen, they're to take these steps. And they're now certifying to the federal government that they're doing these things. Yeah. And if that's not happening...
And we're starting to use these corporate integrity agreements when we suspect repeat behavior comes to our attention from a whistleblower. That becomes an important element because a lot of these companies, as you now see, are under corporate integrity agreements. And they're pretty long, and and it's pretty much like a very heavy-duty probation. So we're trying to see if we can get something done through those.
So a lot of these cases that you're looking at now, the conduct is back in the 90s and early 2000s. I predict that the conduct that you'll see now, if these companies become repeat offenders and have now signed on to these corporate integrity agreements, you will start seeing a lot more individual liability.
Yeah. Now, you asked me if I'm worried about somebody going after me. Well, I'll tell you a true story. January 30th or 31st, 2009, I'm leaving the courtroom where Eli Lilly had just pled guilty to a criminal misdemeanor. And I feel numbness in my left side of my face. And I thought I was having a stroke. This is an exciting time, the biggest settlement in history of a drug and a criminal plea, and there was all kinds of press going on. And this was the only case where the U.S. attorney actually stood up and thanked me for what we did. Usually they don't tell you about thanking us. That's another story. And I feel this, and I'm convinced, and we were going to a party that evening at the U.S. attorney's home to celebrate this major event. And I was convinced somebody from Eli Lilly sprayed something on me.
That case is still...
You get paranoid.
That case is still
it turned out to be Bell's palsy and a few acupuncture treatments, and it went away. Mm-hmm. But I was quite concerned. So do I fear that? Do I think that's possible? Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe I need an antipsychotic.
No. Don't announce your name, please. It's confidential. He's under seal. Can you go to the next one? So here we have the awards to the whistleblowers. So you see some of these large settlements. What are the whistleblowers getting out of these cases? And the statute allows for anywhere between, believe it or not, it's 15 to 30% of the award goes to the whistleblower, depending on where the case settles and whether the individuals take the case.
IRS cases are 10 to 15%. Yeah. Don't forget, IRS is involved in that. It's a new thing, by the way.
Yeah.
We're finally getting the IRS is getting whistleblowers, and they're starting to look at this now.
It is under some circumstances. Yep. Yes, it is.
Yes.
Most likely the individuals do get 1099s from the
Well,
government.
the government, well, that's another issue for the company paying the money. The criminal penalties are taxable, not deductible, but the actual civil penalties are not are tax. You know, they can deduct them, and that's something else that needs to be looked at.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about this. You'll see these huge recoveries. You know, in the Zyprexa case, the relators got over $100 million. In some of these other cases, you know, into individuals, you know, settlements, you know, you're talking tens of millions of dollars. So some people will look at this skeptically and say, hey, wait a sec, all these individuals, they're in it for the money. They're bringing these cases forth just because of the money. And we can tell you that there was a process in place to sort of vet all that out. The facts have to be there, right? We go through that vetting practice. No law firm is going to be in business taking cases out there that are frivolous. There's a lot of money spent on these cases up front. And the
you
U.S.
go
attorneys
for 5 or 10 years with
Yeah.
nothing coming in, everything going out. They can be very worker intensive and very costly.
So the average settlement, you look at all these big settlements, but the average settlement out of the number of cases that have been settled is roughly around $10 million. So you look at that, and the individual will get anywhere from 15 to 25% for blowing the whistle. So he's going to get about $1.5 million. And a lot of times in these cases, there's more than one relator. So that now has to be split between the other whistleblower, the present case. So you're now down to
Risperdal had several relators.
Yeah, and you're now down to $700,000. Well, you're certainly going to have to pay your law firm a percentage of that. So now you're down to maybe $500,000. And half of that's going to go to the federal government in taxes. So now they've put their lives and their careers in jeopardy for up to 7, you know, Johnson & Johnson was 13 years for a long time. Now their name becomes public, and they're out there as a whistleblower. And there are extreme consequences to these individuals when they're identified as whistleblowers. If you go out and try to get a job, first things people do is put their name in Google, and this case is going to come up. You know, companies do take that into consideration when they're going to hire you. So everybody says, these individuals are in it for the money. I can clearly tell you that we have not been involved in those cases where that has been the case. The individuals that we have represented, and the majority of the cases that I reviewed when I was with the Department of Justice, these individuals are put in situations that they should not be put in. And they're being put in these situations by the companies they work for.
Yeah, and they're getting, companies are demanding now they sign agreements. They won't disclose any confidential documents. And companies actually, when they learn who the whistleblower is, are suing the whistleblower on a theory of liability. They breached their agreement on confidential documents. The judges, of course, who are handling these cases don't look very kindly to that kind of behavior, and sometimes that can be very, very counterproductive for the company. But that is what's going on now.
And predicting these kinds of results is basically impossible. No one had any idea that these cases would range up into the billion-dollar range. Any case that's brought to us, yeah, we can give a rough estimate, but you don't know how big the fraud is. You don't know what the company's conduct is going to look like inside. And so some of these cases just go to the wayside. They're never resolved. The whistleblowers put their lives at risk for nothing. Other cases resolve, but it's nowhere near what you think it would resolve for. Just a quick story. So you think I had a case where it was a nurse, and she was put in a career nurse, went into the industry to help people, was put in a situation where she was told to change coding on the bills.
Very common practice.
Told to provide, administer drugs that were clearly not necessary for these patients.
Yeah, the way that they upcode them, which they're not supposed to do, to show it as if it's a different diagnosis, knowing that they shouldn't do that. And that's where we come in, because we have to ferret that out, as we're doing now in these cases in Florida. In fact,
so here she is, single with 3 children. She has a career, she has certification, and she's been put in this position. So what choices does she have? Everybody said, well, just bring it up to the owner. Well, guess what she did? And she was told either follow it or you're gone. And in fact, after she told them, she was then demoted. She was pushed off to the side. She was shunned inside the corporation. So what choice does she have now? She can leave, which is what she did. But then the company blackballed her from any local area practices that were under the same umbrella where she could go out and get a job. So now she's not only, she took the right course in many of minds of saying, hey, try to fix it in-house first, right? Well, these are the things that happened. So then she comes to us, and she says, what they're doing is wrong. I know it's continuing on. Is there any way you can provide some protection? And that's what this False Claims Act statute does.
Yeah.
And just as a side note, the case resolved very successfully for the government.
Yeah.
And
discipline like that is also a violation of the False Claims Act, and in each of these cases where the discipline occurred, the company was penalized substantially for that, and the worker or the employee or the whistleblower got substantially increased interest because of that.
So the case resolved. It was a lot of money back to the federal government. It was close to $3.6 million that was coming back to this individual. And I called her up. And I said, hey, listen, we had some success. We just heard word from the government. The case is successful. You're going to get $3.6 million out of it. Her comment back to me, and she goes, wait, no, that's not right. That's the government's money. I had to spend, close to an hour to convince her that this money was hers. She wanted to give it to the lawyers. She wanted to give it to the government. She had no idea that she was, that this is the type of reward that she would get. She would think maybe, a little bit to get herself back on her feet. So these are the types of individuals that we represent. So when you hear words like snitch or rat, yeah, there may be those individuals out there. There's individuals like that there in any industry. But the system that you have in place to bring this case forward usually weeds those individuals out.
And we have to kind of tell the individuals what they need to understand they may face in going forward. We don't just simply file the case. We warn them very thoroughly so that they're committed to the case, because this is not a type of situation where we're going to spend 5 years putting it together. And the government, right now, we have to give the government the case. It used to be on a silver platter. Now it's platinum. They do not accept the case, or they'll refuse to intervene if they aren't given the case on a really platinum platter, because they don't have the personnel to handle them. And now there's more and more of these smaller cases being filed. So there's a lot going on in this whole area now as we speak.
So we might have to wrap it up, Steve. I think these last couple here. We talked about the relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office is key. You have to be able to speak their language, know how the system works, know what they're looking for. Go ahead. And obviously the impact of these cases that have, now the U.S. Attorney's Offices are focusing on health care. It's not just for the money, it's the real-life impact. As a result of these cases, now pharma companies now have to post on websites how much they're paying their doctors for speaker fees. So when you walk in, I walk into my doctor's office, and he pulls out that prescription pad. He knows what I do. I look at him, I'm looking at that pen to see what drug company's on that pen, and I know as soon as he writes that prescription, I'm going to go onto these Sunshine websites and look up to see what kind of money he's receiving from those drug companies. That's
something you may want to do. Look at drug company websites if a doctor is prescribing, particularly an antipsychotic or an SSRI. Take a look. Find out how much he's been paid.
And by doing this is allowing the public to make better decisions about their health care. So when you're out there, there's all this information that's out there, you can challenge these decisions that your doctor's making just to make sure they're the right ones for you.
And if you have an elderly parent, I tell you now, in a nursing home, and they prescribe Seroquel or one of these drugs, you get the doctor to sit down in one of these chairs and really say, are you getting any money for this? Why are you doing this? Did you see this black box? It warns you that you shouldn't prescribe these drugs to elderly because it may kill them. Why are you giving my mother this drug? Well, we have to calm her down. Or are you giving her the drug because you don't have enough staff to really take care of her adequately?
All right, that pretty much brings us to the conclusion of the program. And again, me and Steve just really would appreciate the time. Hopefully it was informative and certainly been a great audience. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Sure. Yes, that's the problem. They don't care that it's costing, not only it's costing money, it's harming our citizens physically.
So, staying as much away from politics as I can, you can think about the industry that's out there and how it's going to affect that industry and the more suits that they're going to have to prevent against if this is
It has to be exposed. This is where the Montgomery County Bar Association could help. The judiciary could talk more about these things at meetings. This is a serious problem for the state of Pennsylvania. New Jersey has a False Claims Act case. They get money. Philadelphia passed their own ordinance, which is being attacked because they're not allowed to pass an ordinance. It's got to be a statewide statute. All these kind of things are going on.
And sort of, you can make your own decisions as you look, do a little Google search on the Pennsylvania False Claims Act. There have been many attempts to try to get this passed, and there's been an article written on why those attempts have been unsuccessful. Just leave it to yourselves if you're interested in that to read that rather than do some.
And you have to look at the learned intermediary defense in your cases. You may want to take a close look as to whether it's too broad, because doctors are prescribing drugs without the necessary information. They may be on the payroll. We need drugs prescribed by doctors off-label. I'm the first one to say, if you got somebody with cancer or a serious problem, you don't want to tie the doctor's hands and say you can never do that. But there is a difference. It depends on what the drug is and what the reason is. If he's prescribing it off-label to a child, your ears better open up and find out a lot more and see if he was on the payroll. Maybe learned intermediary has gone too far as a defense, and the judiciary, I know we have a lot of judges here, need to take a look at that more closely. And maybe, unless it's a drug for cancer or something significantly that there are no, and you tell the family the true story. I want you to know that I'm prescribing this, it isn't approved by the FDA. In the case of Risperdal, it was actually disapproved for children. Disapproved. And yet they were prescribing it like candy, billions of dollars for children. Now it's approved for children with certain behaviors related to autism and bipolar. Bipolar. That's Dr. Biederman at Harvard, who got millions of dollars.
We better stay away from that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, he gets upset when I get there. You'll hear shortly.
Yeah. I mean, if you do a little research on that, the company has spoke about it and has spoke about the resolution that is reached with the government. We're at the moment prevented from doing that because the case is still under seal. But if you Google the ADHD drugs and put Department of Justice,
I can tell you there is no evidence whatsoever substantiating that your kid will get, your child or your grandchild will get an A, B, C, or D if he takes the drugs. Okay? None. Zero. In fact, it's to the contrary.
They may hit a baseball better, but that's about it. Yeah.
Can you speak louder?
I'm sorry, yeah? That's correct.
Yeah, there are shareholder suits, and what's happening, and that's another issue, the shareholders, when they learn about the problem, are suing. They end up with a settlement, too, for the shareholders. But again, it's still going on. So,
yeah, for the individuals.
Yeah. We don't have a False Claims Act in any state or similar for private insurers. Much more money is being spent by your private insurance company than most of us have. That money isn't coming back to them. We're paying it. We're paying it, frankly, because they don't have any way of doing what we can do for the federal and state government money. Needs to talk about Pennsylvania not even having a whistleblower statute for the state. How about a whistleblower statute so the private insurance companies don't get taken for a loop, which they are? Every dime that you see going here that we got for the federal government, significantly more should have been recovered by the private carriers, but they can't sue because they can't get a class certified. This whole issue of class certification, arbitration in their agreements. The taxpayer is paying for this. We're paying for it.
You mentioned a good point. So you talk about the individuals, and I didn't really touch too much on them with respect to their fines. But a lot of this conduct is old, and by the time it gets to us, statute of limitations to be able to hold those individuals accountable is gone. So it's hard to prosecute them. Also, the companies were very careful about dividing the conduct amongst many individuals. So when you look at the conduct as a whole, clear intent. But when you look at the conduct separately, it's tough to bring those suits. But that's what these corporate compliance agreements now do. Those individuals now have to sign on that say, we are putting things in place to prevent this conduct, and if we're ever aware of it, and it should be brought to us our attention because we're reviewing those reports, and if it is in that report, we're required to report it. They're certifying to the government, and that's linked to the payments now. So if those things are not being done, those individuals now are going to be held liable, and you'll see that very much in the near future.
Very, very important, but it also should apply to private insurance submissions too, and it doesn't.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm telling you, that was surprising because when I first developed it, I was, I'm going over. They were having a buffet thing like you had here at the.
Make it short.
And I'm drooling, and my wife says, "Well, there's this Chinese guy on Ray Street, and he does acupuncture. He's an MD, and I was willing to try anything at that point because I got told this could be going on for 6 months. I had 4 acupuncture treatments, and believe it or not, they worked. So I'm now a proponent of acupuncture.
The doctor did say it will cure your Bell's palsy, but it would affect your looks. So obviously he made that trade-off.
I was very lucky. Let's put it that way.
Sure, it's a good question. So you'll see there's been $17 billion recoveries from the government. There's another statute out there, it's a FIREA statute that focuses primarily on banking. But there are cases that are being brought and pursued and have been successful under the False Claims Act when you have HUD loans that are being out there and affected because that is actual federal government money. So a lot of those suits have a portion of a False Claims Act to help recover those types of loans.
Yeah, some of that money will come back to the federal government.
In addition, though, besides the False Claims Act that we've talked about, IRS has their own False Claims Act.
The SEC does.
The SEC has theirs,
which has been totally abomination on enforcing it.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's early. It's in its early phases. They are having some recoveries.
We keep publicizing the SEC. They're finally starting. Sort of like they've been asleep for 20 years.
But those statutes are mainly out there to focus on the banking industry, but the False Claims Act is certainly a part of it. Yeah.
We need lawyers like you to pursue these things. There are statutes.
So that's another thing, right? So you can have companies out there that you don't have to be an individual. You can be an actual company. And then, if you're in competition with another company, what a great way to slow down this company. Let's go ahead and bring a lawsuit against them alleging that they're false.
In fact, the way we learned about Risperdal was Zyprexa sales reps were saying Risperdal was worse than Zyprexa, and not so much better, but worse than Zyprexa, because it increases prolactin, which is a hormone. And that isn't a problem with Zyprexa and increasing and that's when I sent Joe a packet of boys with breasts. Remember that?
I do. So just real quick, just to answer that question, I mean that's a valid concern, right? Nobody can prevent anybody from filing a lawsuit, right? Anybody's going to file the lawsuit, but the system that's in place, if you're a company and you're going to say, hey, you know what? I got whistleblower information on my other company, and your intent is just to slow that company down. When it goes through this vetting process, you're probably not going to get there because you do have it to give it to the government on a golden platter, right? And the government's going to say, hey, guys, go ahead on your own risk.
You got to have a real whistleblower.
So I think it does happen. We're not aware of it happening in great lengths. But usually the system in place helps take care of that. In addition, you're making statements about this company doing false conduct. And if they're not true, or if they're frivolous, you're going to open yourself up to your own lawsuits with respect to liability and slander.
One of the things we face is when the government decides it isn't going to intervene, we have a right to go forward with the case, and we do on occasion. But when a federal judge hears the government didn't want to intervene, they assume it must be a bad case. So we have to overcome that particular problem.
And most of the ways
too.
we overcome that is when the government doesn't intervene because they just don't have the resources. They say, okay, guys, we understand what's going on.
The judiciary is becoming aware of that.
You take care of it. I'm sorry, there's a question in the back? Yeah. Yeah, they do go to trial,
Yeah.
and they've been quite successful going to trial. It's a very small percentage, just
Very
like any
small.
other industry, about the number of cases that go to trial, but the success rate has been
They're
very good.
usually the smaller cases, because the smaller cases are the ones the government's less likely to intervene in.
So on those cases, when you look at some of the ones that are publicly reported, this is complicated stuff, right? You can imagine getting an expert up there testifying to the uses of this drug and all the studies and the statisticians, their reports showing the support for this drug. And on the other side, you have somebody that's saying no. If you're in that gray area, you're in for a tough battle.
Right.
But if, most of the cases that go to trial, there's some clear distinction where the books were cooked. And that, I think you have a greater chance of success going down that route. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.